Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel. And tonight we're going to talk about something that we take for granted in the 21st century. And that really is keeping warm by a fire, for example, or some form of heating. In the 21st century, we are quite used to having central heating. And obviously, if we suddenly went back in time, we would find it very, very cold, especially on days like we're having at the moment, where it's extremely cold. And obviously, the weather forecast is for more cold weather on its way, basically. So in the past, our ancestors coped mainly by the layers that they wore, and layering clothes is something that we often do even today. So it's very important to put lots of light layers, and our ancestors did the same thing. Our prehistoric ancestors did, our Iron Age ancestors, even right up to the Georgian period and the Victorians. You wore, for example, your linens, your shirts, for example, and then over the top you wore, especially in the 18th and 19th century, your waistcoat and then your coat, for example. It was all about layering, and that kept most people warm. But like I said, in the 21st century, we're so used to having a fireplace, for example. We're also quite used to having radiators dotted around the home. So really, at the flick of a switch, we have instant heat. And like I said, on days like we've had lately, I don't know about you, but we've had our heating on quite a bit. And obviously, with the lockdown now, lockdown number 3, people are staying indoors more. So it's quite important to stay nice and warm, nice and cozy and warm. So our ancestors often had a open fire, a hearth. And if you think of, for example, an Iron Age roundhouse, it was one room. And that was the same even in the medieval period and even into the Tudor to a certain degree. People lived and spent all their time in one space. Whereas today, we often have time spent in a dining room, we sit and watch television in a living room, and then obviously we've got bedrooms, bathrooms, and things like that. So our ancestors often spent time in one place, and the fire was central. It was very, very important, the equivalent of central heating. It was in the center of the room for many, many years. And that fire was used, for example, to keep away pests and parasites, really, especially the smoke going into the rafters. It was also there for the obvious reasons. It kept them warm, and that's what we're talking about tonight. But we also find that the fire was used for cooking. Obviously, it was the main source of cooking any type of food, really, in the past, and that's why fires were kept going even in the summer months. And then obviously it also gave light, and if you look through our playlist when we were talking about lighting, the fire is usually the main source of light. Candles and things like that are very, very expensive. But really, I want to focus on what the Romans did. Now, the Romans came here twice, really, 2 big invasions. They were trading with us before that anyway. And for example, they came here around about 50, 55 BC. That was under Julius Caesar, but it wasn't really a conquest of Britain, or Britannia as they called it. But by 43 AD, Claudius landed on the south coast and it became a conquest. And then famously, in 122 AD, we end up having Hadrian's Wall, cutting the barbarians from the north away. And we were now part of the Roman Empire, Britannia, part of the Roman Empire, the province of Britannia, for example. And the Romans changed a lot of things. And it's quite interesting. If you think of the roundhouse, the Iron Age roundhouse, we had a central fire. We had a fire indoors, keeping us warm, cooking our food, lighting our room, and keeping pests away. But the Romans didn't really do things like that. Some Roman houses did have braziers. These were often iron in construction, and you put wood in them, or sometimes even coals, and that kept rooms nice and warm. But the ultimate in Roman design, in housing, interior design, is obviously something known as the hypocaust. And the hypocaust is an amazing piece of engineering, and hopefully you can see that in the picture there. Now, what we must stress to start with is not every Roman house had a hypocaust system, and people often forget that. People often say, what has the Romans done for us? And they say, well, they gave us central heating. Well, technically not. If you think of the central hearth that we were talking about in the roundhouse, we had a central fire then, so they didn't technically give us central heating. Some people say, well, they gave us the roads that we have in this country. Well, actually, we had roads or trackways going as far back as prehistoric times, but they did give us a solid metal surface, as it became known, a proper, true Roman road. And they obviously travel across the country in very straight lines. However, when you talk about the Romans, we always have to remember they did have this interesting heating system. And on a day like this, and a period like this, where it is quite bleak and cold outside, this would be very, very useful. And what I'm going to do is just describe how these work in tonight's video. So, as I said, Iron Age people had the fire indoors. The weird thing is Romans often had the fire outdoors, and I will explain now. If you look at a Roman building, and this is just a simple illustration. So you've got the walls of the house there, and obviously it would be bigger than this. It's not to scale. What they often had outside is a small pit, which was often referred to, as we would refer to it today, as the stokehold, really, or the furnace. And if you have slaves, your servants of the household, they would often sit out there chopping firewood, for example, and laying the fire. Now, what you will notice is the house is actually raised on stilts. Now, these stilts were sometimes made of stone columns. If you go to Hadrian's Wall, for example, Chester's Roman fort on Hadrian's Wall, or Calernum as it was called, that uses stone columns, and those stone columns would have been quarried locally, and they would have held up the floor very simply. However, in some places they used rocks, very much like a dry stone wall, but actually cemented together with famous Roman cement. Or in this case, we've got tiles, and these are known as pili, and they are stacked, cemented together, and they're designed to hold up the floor. So below every Roman floor with a hypocaust, remember, not every Roman house had these, if you have a hypocaust system, there would be a void underneath the floor. So you would have this space down here where there would be circulatory air. And what you will notice is the fire in the stokehold or furnace is burning away nicely. The slaves, the servants would have been keeping that lit. And what would happen is the hot gases, the hot smoke travels under the floor. And because the floor has this void underneath it, that whole space is going to fill with hot gas. It'll be really, really hot down there. And you will also notice on the top there, we have stone slabs or flagstones, and then you would also have a very thin skimming of plaster. And sometimes, if you're very, very wealthy, you may even have a mosaic on top of that. And basically, this has to be kept relatively thin, strong, but relatively thin. And that's because the hot gases will build up under there and then slowly start to circulate through the stone, through the plaster, through the mosaic, for example, and the floor will eventually get hot. So you will be able to touch the floor in a Roman building if it has a hypocaust, and it will be very, very warm, which is absolutely brilliant idea, especially if you're having a cold spell. You will get that room nice and warm, and you will walk around it. You can even walk around it without any shoes on. Saying that, in a Roman bathhouse, they often had many furnaces, many stokeholes, and they heated the floor up so hot it would be unbearable to put bare feet on the ground. And that's why you often had things like wooden bath shoes, very much like a flip-flop, to keep your feet off the hot ground. But the smoke just doesn't linger under the floor. That would be madness, really. What a lot of houses had is a flue. And in this case, what we have here is the hot gases is going under the floor, and they're actually going up the wall. And that's because what you have in the walls of some hypocaust, not all of them, and like I said, not every Roman house had a hypocaust system, you would have these flue tiles, sometimes called box tiles, or in particular the tubuli. And what they are is clay chimneys, tiny little chimneys that go up through your wall. And then once again, you have some very thin plaster spread across it. That was often painted and decorated, depending on the room as well. For example, a dining room would have scenes of eating, and areas that were used for cooking, for example, would have different animal scenes or hunting scenes on them. And the heat and the gases will go up the walls also. So not only are the floors hot, but you also have the walls heating up as well, very much like a radiator in a modern home. And then what would happen is at the very, very top, there would be small vents allowing the air out and allowing the gases out. And that's very important because what you want is the hot fire to be drawn under the floor and then up through the walls. It's very much like getting a chimney to work correctly. And obviously, if you are a certain age, you may remember, for example, having the fireplace screened off with a newspaper, for example, guaranteeing that you will get the correct circulation of the air to draw the smoke and the heat up through the chimney. So if you're lucky on a day like this, in a period like this when it was relatively cold, and you live in a Roman house, if you're lucky, you have the money, you would definitely get yourself a hypocaust. But like I said, not all houses have hypocaust. Not all of them have heated walls as well as heated floors. And like I said, this was a luxury item. And these not just happened in Britain. You would also find these abroad, especially in the cooler countries like Germania or even Gaul, which is Germany and France. But it's interesting, as I always say, because we heat our homes up internally. The Iron Age people did that. If you're thinking medieval feasting halls at Christmas time or during Twelfth Night, for example, you would have a central fire, and that was the norm for many years. In other words, it was a fire within your house heating it up. But the Romans, I also always find this fascinating. The fireplace is actually outside, except it heats the building up internally. It's quite an amazing system, really, and that's the hypocaust. So hopefully you are staying in. Remember the government guidelines, unless you have to go out, don't go out. So hopefully you're staying in. And if you are cold, we are quite lucky today because at the flick of a switch or even the turning of a dial, we can change the heat of a room. If you think back to our ancestors on a night like this, when it was cold, they had to have that fire going. They had to all huddle around wearing their layers of clothing. And obviously, as I said, if you're lucky enough to be in a Roman building with a hypocaust, it was toasty warm in there. What I will say though is if you do travel around eventually after the lockdown to places like English heritage sites like Hadrian's Wall, it is worth having a look at hypocaust systems, and they are an amazing piece of technology, really. It really is worth having a look at them and wondering what it would have been like in those rooms, heated up, warmed up on very cold periods. Anyway, on that note, stay safe, stay in unless you have to for certain reasons, and we'll see you again tomorrow with yet another video. Make sure you subscribe and let us know what sort of videos that you would like. Speak to you soon. Bye.